Daniel's life had always been marked by simplicity, but not the kind of simplicity that comes from lack of ambition or laziness. It was the deliberate simplicity of a man who understood what truly mattered in life. He woke up every morning at 5:30, not because he had to, but because he loved those quiet moments before the world awakened. The ritual was always the same. He would stand by the kitchen window of the modest house he had bought with 15 years of hard work, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, while the coffee maker gurgled and filled the air with that comforting aroma that reminded him of his father. His father had been a construction worker, a man of few words but immense wisdom, who had taught Daniel that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he builds with his own hands and how he treats others along the way. Daniel had taken those lessons to heart, building his construction materials company from the ground up, starting with a small storefront and gradually expanding through reputation and trust rather than aggressive business tactics or shortcuts. His company wasn't large by any corporate standards, but it was solid, honest, and respected throughout the community. He knew every customer by name, and not just their names, but their stories too. There was Mr. Silver, the retired teacher who was slowly renovating his old family home room by room, always stopping by on Thursdays to buy materials and share stories about his grandchildren. There was the young couple, Lucas and Patricia, who were building their first home themselves to save money, and Daniel had spent countless evenings after closing time teaching them how to properly mix cement and lay bricks. He remembered the birthdays of his suppliers' children, sent flowers when someone was sick, and had never once in 20 years left a debt unpaid or a promise broken. At 42 years old, Daniel had the kind of face that told a story. Deeply tanned from years of working under the sun, with smile lines around his eyes that spoke of genuine joy rather than forced politeness. His hands were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who wasn't afraid to unload trucks alongside his employees or help a customer carry heavy bags to their car. He had a smile that could light up any room, not the practiced smile of a salesman, but the authentic warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed connecting with people. He was the kind of man his mother, God rest her soul, used to say was truly good people, the kind who sleeps peacefully at night because his conscience is clear and he owes nothing to anyone, neither in money nor in moral debts. Daniel met Mariana at the wedding of mutual friends, Carlos and Juliana, 12 years ago. It was one of those beautiful spring afternoons where everything seems possible and the world feels full of promise. The ceremony had been simple but elegant, held in a small garden venue decorated with white roses and fairy lights. Daniel had been standing by the bar, nursing a beer and chatting with some old friends from his neighborhood, when he heard it. A laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine, the kind of laugh that makes you want to know what's so funny, even before you see who's laughing. He turned and saw her for the first time. Mariana was beautiful, yes, with long dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders and eyes that sparkled when she smiled. But it wasn't her physical beauty that struck him most. It was the way she threw her head back when she laughed, completely unself-conscious, the way she gestured animatedly while telling a story to a group of women, the way she seemed to radiate life and energy. He spent the next hour working up the courage to approach her, finally doing so when she was alone at the buffet table, carefully selecting desserts. "You should try the chocolate mousse," he had said, immediately feeling foolish for such a mundane opening line. But Mariana had turned to him with that brilliant smile and said, "Only if you promise to help me eat it. I have a weakness for chocolate, but my waistline definitely doesn't need a whole serving." They had spent the rest of the evening talking, first about the wedding, then about everything and nothing. She told him she worked as a salesperson in a clothing boutique at the mall, that she had dreams of traveling the world, of seeing the Eiffel Tower and walking along the beaches of Thailand, of owning beautiful clothes and living in a house with a big closet. Daniel had listened, charmed by her enthusiasm, and shared his own simpler dreams, expanding his business enough to provide well for a family, maybe buying a slightly bigger house with a nice backyard for growing vegetables, taking weekend trips to the mountains or the beach. She had laughed at his modesty, but not unkindly. "You're refreshingly down to earth," she had said. "Most guys try to impress me with stories about how successful they're going to be or how much money they'll make. "You're just real." He had taken that as a compliment, not realizing until much later that perhaps she had been disappointed by his lack of grand ambitions rather than charmed by his authenticity. They started dating shortly after, and for the first few years everything seemed perfect. Mariana appeared to have settled contentedly into the life Daniel could offer. She moved into his modest two-bedroom house after they got married, in a simple ceremony attended by close friends and family. The house was small, just 900 square feet, but Daniel had put so much work into it. He had personally renovated the kitchen, installing the cabinets with his own hands, choosing tiles that Mariana said she liked, painting the walls in soft colors that made the space feel warm and inviting. The backyard was his pride and joy, a small patch of green where he grew tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs. He would spend Saturday mornings out there, hands in the soil, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing life from the earth. The front porch, though tiny, had become their sanctuary. Daniel had built a wooden bench and placed it there, along with 2 comfortable chairs he'd found at a garage sale and refinished himself. On Saturday nights after dinner, they would sit out there with a bottle of inexpensive wine, watching the neighborhood slowly quiet down for the evening, talking about their week, making modest plans for the future. During those early years, Mariana had seemed happy. She would come home from work at the boutique and tell him about difficult customers or funny incidents, and he would share stories from the shop about the characters he dealt with every day. They would cook dinner together, simple meals that Daniel had learned from his mother, and Mariana would put on music and dance around the kitchen while he chopped vegetables. On Sundays, they would sleep late, then spend the afternoon watching movies on their old television or taking walks in the park downtown. They talked about having children, but Mariana always said, "Someday, when the time is right," and Daniel never pushed, figuring she would know when she was ready. He was a patient man, after all, willing to wait for her to feel comfortable with such a big step. Looking back now, he realized there had been signs, small things he had dismissed or rationalized away. The way she would sometimes look at jewelry store windows with a longing that went beyond casual interest. The way she would flip through fashion magazines and sigh, marking pages with outfits that cost more than their monthly mortgage payment. The way her eyes would linger on luxury cars when they drove through the wealthy neighborhoods. The way she had started working later hours at the boutique, explaining that she needed to make extra commission, even though their finances were comfortable enough. The way she had gradually stopped laughing that big, genuine laugh he had fallen in love with, replacing it with something more practiced and controlled. Everything began to change on that fateful Tuesday afternoon in late September. Daniel had closed the shop early, something he rarely did, because he had finally secured a meeting with Roberto Mendez, owner of Mendez Construction, one of the largest construction companies in the state. For months, Daniel had been working on a proposal for a partnership. His idea was simple but potentially revolutionary for his small business. Mendez Construction was constantly building housing developments and commercial properties, and they needed a reliable, honest supplier for materials. Daniel could provide that reliability at competitive prices, and in return he would gain the steady, large-volume business that would allow him to expand, hire more employees, maybe even open a second location in the neighboring city where his cousin lived. It was the opportunity he had been working toward for years, the chance to take his father's legacy and grow it into something that could provide security not just for himself and Mariana, but for the families of the employees he hoped to hire. He had spent weeks preparing the proposal, staying up late at night running numbers, consulting with his accountant, making sure everything was perfect. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock, which meant he could close the shop at 2, go home to shower and change into his best clothes, which admittedly weren't very fancy, but were clean and presentable, and then drive to the downtown restaurant where Roberto had suggested they meet. Daniel had driven home that Tuesday afternoon with his heart full of hope and excitement. The late September sun was warm on his face through the car window, and he found himself already imagining how he would tell Mariana the good news. He would take her out to dinner somewhere nice, not fancy, but nicer than their usual places, maybe that Italian restaurant she had mentioned wanting to try. They would celebrate this new chapter together, toast to the future with something better than their usual cheap wine. He pulled into the driveway at 2:15, the engine of his old but well-maintained truck ticking as it cooled. He practically bounded up the front steps and through the door, a smile already on his face. "Mariana," he called out, "you won't believe what happened. That meeting I told you about with Roberto Mendez, it's finally happening. This afternoon." But when he found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her phone clutched in her hand, that smile on his face began to fade. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't excitement or happiness for his news. It was something else, something distant and almost irritated, as if he had interrupted something important. "That's nice," she said flatly, her eyes already returning to her phone screen. "The meeting is at 3, he continued, trying to recapture his enthusiasm, trying to share this moment with her. "This could really change everything for us, Mariana. If this partnership works out, we could finally take that trip you've been wanting. Maybe not Paris right away, but we could start with something closer, maybe Mexico or the Caribbean." She made a non-committal sound, her thumbs moving rapidly over her phone's keyboard. Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling something cold settle in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but that made him deeply uncomfortable. "Who are you texting?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light and casual, but hearing the slight edge that crept into his voice anyway. "Just Carla, from work," Mariana replied without looking up. "She's having some drama with her boyfriend and needed to vent." Daniel nodded, wanting to believe her, needing to believe her, because the alternative was a dark road his mind didn't want to travel down. "Okay. Well, I'm going to shower and get ready. Wish me luck." "Good luck," she said automatically, her eyes never leaving the screen. Daniel went to the bathroom and stood under the hot water, trying to wash away the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. He told himself he was being paranoid, that Mariana was just having an off day, that everyone was entitled to be distracted sometimes. He got dressed in his best khaki pants and the blue button-down shirt Mariana had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, combed his hair, and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked nervous but presentable, like a man on the verge of something important. When he emerged from the bedroom, Mariana was no longer on the couch. He found her in the bathroom, applying makeup with more care than she usually did for an evening at home. "You look nice," he said, and she glanced at him in the mirror. "Thanks, I might go out with the girls from work later. They're talking about getting drinks." "On a Tuesday?" Daniel asked, and immediately regretted it when he saw her expression harden. "Is that a problem?" No, of course not. Have fun." He kissed her cheek, tasting the perfume she had applied, something new and expensive smelling that he didn't recognize. "I'll call you after the meeting and let you know how it went." The meeting with Roberto Mendez took place at Vittorio's, an upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of downtown that Daniel had never been to before. The kind of place where the waiters wore black vests and ties, where the menu had no prices listed on the copy they gave to guests, where the wine list was thick as a book. Daniel felt profoundly out of place the moment he walked through the doors, his khakis and button-down suddenly feeling shabby in comparison to the suits and designer dresses he saw around him. But he squared his shoulders and gave his name to the host, who led him to a corner table where Roberto Mendez was already waiting. Roberto was everything Daniel wasn't. Tall, with silver hair styled perfectly, wearing a suit that Daniel suspected cost more than 3 months of his mortgage payments, a watch that gleamed gold on his wrist. He stood when Daniel approached, extending a hand with a smile that showed perfect white teeth. "Daniel, so glad you could make it. Please sit. Sit." His handshake was firm, practiced, the grip of a man who had closed countless deals. "Thank you so much for meeting with me, Mr. Mendez," Daniel said, sitting down and trying not to feel intimidated by the elegant surroundings. "Please call me Roberto. No need for formality. We're both businessmen here, just on different scales for now." There was something in the way he said, "for now," that Daniel couldn't quite interpret. Was it encouraging, suggesting that Daniel could grow to Roberto's level? Or was it condescending, implying that the difference in their scales was vast and likely to remain so? Over the next hour and a half, they talked business. Daniel presented his proposal, laying out the numbers, explaining his vision for how a partnership could benefit both of them. Roberto listened attentively, asking intelligent questions, nodding at appropriate moments, occasionally making notes on a leather-bound notebook he pulled from his briefcase. He ordered wine without looking at the prices, an expensive bottle that made Daniel nervous when he glimpsed the cost, and kept filling Daniel's glass even as Daniel tried to pace himself, aware that he had to drive home. "This is impressive work, Daniel," Roberto said at one point, tapping the proposal documents. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. I like dealing with thorough people. I believe in doing things right," Daniel replied. "My father taught me that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing well." "Your father was a wise man," Roberto said, and something flickered in his eyes that Daniel couldn't read. "Tell me, Daniel, what do you know about me? About my company?" Daniel had done his research. "Mendez Construction has been around for 35 years. You started it yourself after working as a foreman for another company. You've built some of the most prominent developments in the state, including the Riverside Complex and the Downtown Convention Center renovation. You employ over 200 people and have an annual revenue in the tens of millions." Roberto smiled. "You've done your homework. Good. But let me tell you something that isn't in the public records, Daniel. Do you know how I really got ahead in this business?" Daniel shook his head, and Roberto leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "I learned early on that in business, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead. The nice guys, the honest guys like your father probably was, they work hard their whole lives and end up with modest little shops that barely keep them afloat. But the guys who are willing to bend the rules, who understand that ethics are flexible, who know that power and money are the only things that really matter in this world, those are the guys who end up with empires." Daniel felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut, but he smiled politely. "I believe you can be successful and ethical at the same time." "That's cute," Roberto said, and his tone made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. "That's the kind of naive thinking that will keep you exactly where you are, running a small shop in a working-class neighborhood. But you know what? I like you. You remind me of myself when I was younger, before I learned how the world really works. So, I'll tell you what, I'm going to think about your proposal. Give me a few weeks to look over the numbers, talk to my people, and I'll get back to you. How does that sound?" "That sounds great, Roberto. Thank you so much for your time." They shook hands again, and Daniel left the restaurant feeling oddly unsettled, despite the apparent success of the meeting. Something about Roberto's words, about his philosophy, sat wrong with Daniel, but he pushed the feeling aside. Maybe that's just how successful people talked. Maybe he was being too sensitive, too bound by his father's old-fashioned notions of how business should be conducted. When he got home around 5:30, Mariana was gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter in her handwriting. "Out with the girls, don't wait up." Daniel stood there holding the note, that cold feeling from earlier returning, stronger now. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the way a sailor can feel a storm coming long before it appears on the horizon. But he didn't know what to do with the feeling, so he did what he always did when he was troubled. He went out to his garden. The late afternoon sun was golden and warm, and Daniel spent the next hour working the soil, pulling weeds, checking the tomatoes that were just beginning to ripen on the vine. He talked to himself, which he often did when he was alone, working through his thoughts out loud. "Maybe I'm being crazy," he said to a particularly healthy tomato plant. "Maybe I'm seeing problems where there aren't any. Mariana's allowed to have a social life. I don't own her. And Roberto, well, he's from a different world. That doesn't make him a bad person, just different." But no matter how much he tried to rationalize, the uneasy feeling persisted. 3 weeks passed, and during those 3 weeks, Daniel watched his marriage quietly unravel without fully understanding what was happening. Mariana became increasingly distant, increasingly preoccupied with her phone, increasingly absent from their home and their life together. She started working later and later hours, sometimes not coming home until 9 or 10 at night. When Daniel asked about it, she said the boutique was understaffed and she was picking up extra shifts. When he suggested they spend a quiet Sunday together like they used to, she said she had already made plans with friends. When he tried to initiate intimacy, she claimed to be too tired or not in the mood. She started dressing differently, more stylishly, in clothes that Daniel didn't remember her buying. She had her hair done at an expensive salon, came home with her nails perfectly manicured in colors that changed every week. When he commented on it, saying she looked beautiful but asking if maybe she was spending too much, she had snapped at him. What? I'm not allowed to take care of myself? I'm not allowed to look nice? Maybe if you cared more about your appearance, about being successful, about being somebody instead of just a nobody who sells hammers and nails, you'd understand why these things matter. The words had stung worse than any physical blow. Daniel had stood there in their kitchen, holding a dish towel, staring at this woman he had loved for 12 years and barely recognizing her. Then, exactly 3 weeks after the meeting at Vittorio's, the world started falling apart. It began with a phone call on a Wednesday morning. Daniel was at the shop, helping a customer select the right type of wood stain, when his phone rang. It was Gerald Martinez, the owner of Martinez Home Improvement Centers, a small chain of 3 stores that had been one of Daniel's best customers for the past 8 years. "Daniel, I'm sorry to do this, but we're going to have to cancel our contract," Gerald said, and he did sound genuinely sorry. "What? Gerald, why? Is there a problem with the quality, the pricing? Just tell me what's wrong and I'll fix it." "It's nothing you did. We're having some financial troubles and we need to consolidate our supply chain, work with bigger companies that can give us better volume discounts. It's just business, Daniel. Nothing personal." Daniel's mind raced. "Gerald, I can match any price you're being offered. I can work with you on payment terms. Please, let's talk about this face to face." "I'm sorry, Daniel. The decision's already been made. We'll settle up our current account by the end of the month." The line went dead. Daniel stood there staring at his phone, feeling the first flutter of real panic. Martinez Home Improvement Centers accounted for almost 30% of his revenue. Losing them was a serious blow, but not fatal. He could recover from it. He would just need to hustle, find new customers, maybe lower his prices slightly to attract more business. But it was only the beginning. That afternoon, 2 more calls came, both from suppliers he had worked with for years, both with the same message. They needed immediate payment of all outstanding invoices, even though those invoices weren't due for another 60 to 90 days according to their standard terms. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but we've had some cash flow issues, and we need to call in our receivables," said Tom Henderson from Henderson Lumber Supply. "But Tom, we've been doing business for 15 years. You know I'm good for it. These invoices aren't even due yet." "Company policy is changing. If you can't pay immediately, we'll have to put your account on hold until you can." Similar conversation with Patricia Chen from Chen Hardware Distributors. Daniel tried to remain calm, tried to figure out what was happening. This couldn't be coincidence. 3 major disruptions in his business relationships in a single day. Something was wrong. That evening, the bank called. It was Mr. Pritchard from the Commercial Accounts Department, someone Daniel had known for years, who had approved his business loans and had always been friendly. "Mr. Ferreira, I need you to come into the branch tomorrow morning. There are some irregularities in your business account that we need to discuss." "What kind of irregularities?" "I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be here at 9? Daniel barely slept that night. Mariana came home late after 11, smelling of wine and expensive perfume. When he tried to talk to her about what was happening with the business, about his worry and fear, she had been dismissive. "I'm sure you're overreacting. Things will be fine." But her tone suggested she neither knew nor cared whether things would be fine. The next morning at the bank, Mr. Pritchard sat across the desk from Daniel with a stack of papers and a troubled expression. "Daniel, I'm going to be straight with you because I respect you and I respect what your father built. Someone has filed a complaint claiming that your business is engaged in fraudulent billing practices. They've provided documentation that appears to show you've been overcharging customers and falsifying invoices." Daniel's blood ran cold. "That's absolutely not true. Who filed this complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to say, but the bank takes these allegations very seriously. Until this is resolved, we're freezing your business accounts. You won't be able to access your funds or use your credit lines." "But I have payroll to make, I have bills to pay. If you freeze my accounts, I can't operate." "I'm sorry, Daniel, it's out of my hands. This comes from higher up. My advice is to get a lawyer and get this sorted out as quickly as possible." Daniel left the bank feeling like he was in a nightmare. In less than 24 hours, his business had been essentially destroyed. No major customers, suppliers demanding immediate payment he couldn't make, and his bank accounts frozen. This wasn't bad luck. This was deliberate, calculated destruction. But who and why? Over the next 2 weeks, things went from bad to catastrophic. Unable to pay his suppliers or his employees, Daniel had to lay everyone off. His 3 employees, Juan, Michael, and Sarah, who had been with him for years, who had families to support, looked at him with shock and betrayal when he had to tell them he couldn't pay them anymore. The shop had to close. The bills piled up. The mortgage company sent a notice that his house would be foreclosed if he didn't catch up on payments immediately. His truck was repossessed, and through it all, Mariana's contempt grew more open, more vicious. "I should have known," she said one night, standing in their bedroom doorway with her arms crossed, looking at him with disgust as he sat on the bed, head in his hands, surrounded by bills and legal notices. "I should have known you'd never amount to anything. My friends tried to warn me. They said you had no ambition, no drive. But I thought you were different. I thought you were just humble, that you'd eventually step up and be a real man. But you're not. You're just a loser, a pathetic, weak loser who couldn't hold on to a simple business even when your father handed it to you." "Mariana, please," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Something's happening here. This isn't just bad luck or bad management. Someone is deliberately destroying me. I just need time to figure out what's going on." "Excuses," she spat. "That's all I ever hear from you, excuses. You can't accept that you failed because you're not good enough, so you have to make up conspiracy theories to make yourself feel better. Well, I'm done. I'm done living like this, done being married to a failure." She turned and walked away, and Daniel heard her making a phone call in the living room, her voice low and intimate in a way it hadn't been with him in months. He couldn't make out the words, but he heard her laugh, that laugh he had fallen in love with 12 years ago at that wedding, except now it was directed at someone else. The next day, following a hunch he hated himself for having, Daniel did something he had never done before. He left the house mid-morning and drove downtown, parking where he could watch the entrance to Vittorio's, the restaurant where he had met with Roberto Mendez. He felt pathetic sitting in a borrowed car. His truck had been repossessed 3 days earlier, and he'd had to borrow his neighbor's old Honda, watching a restaurant like some kind of detective in a bad movie. But something was pulling him here, some instinct he couldn't ignore. At 12:15, a familiar car pulled up to the valet stand, a silver Mercedes that Daniel recognized, and out stepped Roberto Mendez, looking as impeccable as ever in a charcoal suit. The valet took his keys and Roberto walked toward the entrance. But then he paused, turning back toward the street, and Daniel's heart stopped. Because walking toward Roberto, smiling in a way that lit up her entire face, wearing a dress Daniel had never seen before, and definitely couldn't have afforded, was Mariana. Roberto's face broke into a broad smile. He opened his arms, and Mariana walked into them. They embraced, and it wasn't the embrace of business associates or casual friends. It was intimate, familiar, the embrace of lovers. Daniel watched as Roberto kissed her, not on the cheek but on the lips, watched as Mariana's hand came up to touch his face with a tenderness she hadn't shown Daniel in months. They walked into the restaurant together, Roberto's hand on the small of Mariana's back, and disappeared inside. Daniel sat in that borrowed car for 2 hours, unable to move, barely able to breathe. His wife was having an affair with Roberto Mendez, the man he had approached for a business partnership, the man who... Daniel's mind started making connections he didn't want to make. The timing, the meeting 3 weeks ago, the sudden destruction of his business relationships, the frozen bank accounts. Roberto had shown his cards during that lunch, had essentially admitted he was the kind of man who would do anything to get ahead, who didn't believe in ethics or fairness. And Daniel had walked right into it, had given his proposal, had shared his financial information, had exposed himself completely to a predator. And somehow, somewhere in all of this, Roberto had gotten to Mariana. Or maybe Mariana had gotten to Roberto. Maybe she had been looking for a way out, and Roberto had offered her everything Daniel couldn't: wealth, power, luxury, the life she had always wanted, but that Daniel's modest success could never provide. Daniel finally drove home as the sun was setting, feeling hollowed out, destroyed in a way that had nothing to do with money or business. When Mariana came home that night hours later, he was sitting in the dark living room, waiting. "Where were you?" he asked quietly. She jumped, not having seen him in the shadows. "Jesus, Daniel, you scared me. I was out with friends." "Don't lie to me anymore, Mariana. Please, just don't lie." Something in his voice must have told her he knew, because her face changed. The mask of fake concern dropped away, replaced by something cold and hard. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth? I'm seeing someone else, someone who can actually provide for me, who isn't a complete failure at life." "Roberto Mendez," Daniel said, not a question, but a statement. She didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, Roberto. A real man, powerful, successful, respected. Everything you're not. How long? Does it matter?" "Yes." She shrugged. "He contacted me about 2 months ago, said he had met you, did some research, found me on social media, started messaging me. We started meeting for coffee, then lunch, then—" She trailed off, but Daniel didn't need her to finish. "He destroyed my business," Daniel said. "He orchestrated everything that happened. The cancelled contracts, the supplier demands, the frozen bank accounts, all of it." Mariana laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Daniel, always looking for someone else to blame. Maybe your business failed because you're incompetent. Did that ever occur to you?" "I'm not incompetent. I ran that business successfully for 20 years, and then I meet Roberto Mendez, and within 3 weeks everything falls apart. That's not coincidence." "Believe whatever fairy tales you need to sleep at night," Mariana said, heading toward the bedroom. "I'm packing some things. I'm moving out." "To be with him?" "Yes. To be with a real man who can give me the life I deserve." Daniel watched her pack, watched her take her clothes, her jewelry, her things, loading them into suitcases and bags with the efficiency that suggested she had been planning this for a while. When she was done, she stood in the doorway one last time, looking at him with something that might have been pity, but looked more like contempt. "You know what your problem is, Daniel? You're too nice, too honest, too naive. You think if you work hard and treat people fairly, good things will happen. But that's not how the world works. The world belongs to people like Roberto, people who aren't afraid to take what they want, to step on whoever they need to step on to get ahead. You could have been someone, but you chose to be nobody, and I'm not going to be nobody with you." She walked out, the sound of her heels clicking on the front walkway, and Daniel heard a car engine start. Not her car. Something more expensive. Roberto must have been waiting for her. And then they were gone, and Daniel was alone in the house that was about to be taken away from him, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been systematically destroyed. The next few weeks were the darkest of Daniel's life. The bank foreclosed on the house. His possessions were sold to pay creditors. He moved into a tiny room in a boarding house in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. A place with peeling paint and a shared bathroom down the hall, and the smell of old cooking grease that never quite went away. He found work as a day laborer on construction sites, the supreme irony not lost on him that he now worked for others doing the same work his father had done before he had built the business that Daniel had inherited and then lost. The work was hard, physical, exhausting. He would come home each night with his body aching, his hands blistered, covered in dust and sweat. But in a strange way, the physical exhaustion was a blessing. It meant he was too tired to think, too tired to feel the full weight of everything he had lost. Meanwhile, Mariana's new life was on full display on social media. She had never bothered to unfriend or block Daniel, perhaps because she wanted him to see, wanted him to know what he was missing. She posted constantly. Photos of herself in designer clothes at expensive restaurants, weekend trips to beach resorts and mountain chalets, pictures of Roberto's mansion with its infinity pool and panoramic views, selfies in Roberto's luxury cars. She looked happy, radiant even, the Mariana he remembered from when they first met, laughing and carefree. Except this time, her laughter and joy were bankrolled by a man who had deliberately destroyed Daniel's life, for reasons Daniel still didn't fully understand. The mutual friends they had shared slowly distanced themselves. Some called once or twice awkward conversations, where they claimed to want to help but never followed through. Most just disappeared. Their Facebook friendships quietly ended, their numbers suddenly not working when Daniel tried to call. He understood. Failure was contagious in people's minds. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had lost everything, and there was something else too. A narrative that had started circulating through their social circle. Daniel had been bad at business, had mismanaged his finances, had maybe even been skimming money or doing something unethical. The whispers followed him even to the construction sites where he worked. Other laborers would give him sideways looks, would talk in low voices that stopped when he approached. One day during lunch break, a man named Paolo, who had worked in construction for 40 years, sat down next to Daniel. "I heard about what happened to you," Paolo said, pulling out a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. "The business, your wife, everything." Daniel nodded but didn't say anything. What was there to say? "People are saying you were crooked, that you got what you deserved. But I've been around long enough to know the difference between a man who's corrupt and a man who's been sabotaged. And you, my friend, you got the look of someone who was sabotaged." Daniel looked at the older man. "What makes you say that?" "Because I've seen it before. Rich men, powerful men, they don't like competition. And they especially don't like competition from honest men, because honest men make them look bad by comparison. So when an honest man starts getting successful, starts maybe becoming a threat or just being too visible, they destroy him. Not with violence, because violence is obvious and illegal. They destroy him with paperwork, with bureaucracy, with turning his friends and customers against him, with taking everything he has until he's left with nothing." "That's exactly what happened," Daniel said quietly. "I know. And I'm guessing whoever did this to you also took your woman. Because that's the ultimate humiliation, isn't it? Not just destroying a man's livelihood, but also proving he can't even keep his own woman." Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes, but blinked them back. "Why would someone do that? I never hurt anyone. I just wanted to run my business and live my life." Paolo took a bite of his sandwich and chewed thoughtfully. "Some men need to destroy others to feel powerful. Some men can't stand to see goodness in the world because it reminds them of everything they're not. And some men do it just because they can, because there's no one to stop them." They sat in silence for a while, and then Paolo said something that would stay with Daniel. "But here's what you need to remember. Men like that, they can take your money, your business, even your woman. But they can't take who you are unless you let them. You keep your integrity, you keep your character, and eventually the truth has a way of coming out. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. The universe has a way of balancing the scales." Daniel wanted to believe him, but in that moment, broken and exhausted and alone, it seemed like empty comfort, the kind of thing people said to make themselves feel better about the injustice of the world. And then on a rainy Saturday afternoon, 3 months after his life had collapsed, everything changed. Daniel was sitting in a small, dingy diner near the boarding house, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and a plate of eggs that had gone cold while he read the want ads in the newspaper, looking for work that paid better than day labor. The construction job had ended yesterday, and he needed to find something new soon, or he wouldn't be able to pay even his modest rent. The bell above the door chimed, and Daniel glanced up out of habit. An older man walked in, maybe mid-60s, with silver hair cut precisely, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that was both serious and kind. He wore a well-tailored suit, not flashy like Roberto's, but quality, the suit of a professional man. The man looked around the diner, his eyes scanning the scattered patrons until they landed on Daniel. Recognition flashed across his face, and he walked directly to Daniel's booth. "Daniel Ferreira?" he asked. Daniel nodded warily. "Can I help you? May I sit? I have something important to discuss with you." Daniel gestured to the seat across from him, and the man sat down, placing a worn leather briefcase on the table. "My name is Augusto Correa. I was your father's accountant for the last 15 years of his life." Daniel frowned, trying to remember. His father had died 15 years ago after a sudden heart attack. Daniel had been 27, just starting to really understand the construction materials business his father had left him. He vaguely remembered an accountant at the funeral, but the memories of that time were blurred by grief. "I remember you," Daniel said slowly. "You helped me with the estate paperwork." "Yes, and I've been waiting for this day for a long time." Augusto opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope yellowed with age. Your father gave me specific instructions before he died. He said that if anything happened to him, I was to keep certain documents and information secret until you were ready. Ready for what? Ready to receive his true legacy. Daniel's heart began to beat faster. What are you talking about? My father left me the business and a small life insurance policy. That was it. There was barely enough to cover his funeral expenses and a few months of bills. Augusto smiled sadly. That's what your father wanted everyone to think, including you, for a time. But the truth is quite different. Your father, Daniel, was a very wealthy man, and you are his sole heir. Daniel stared at the older man, sure he had misunderstood. What? Augusto opened the envelope and began pulling out documents, deeds to properties, stock certificates, bank statements, investment portfolios, legal documents showing trusts and holdings. Daniel's hands trembled as he took the papers, his eyes scanning page after page of information that didn't make sense. Properties scattered across 3 states, investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands, some worth millions, ownership stakes in several small but profitable companies, a portfolio that even 15 years after his father's death was worth an enormous amount of money. According to the documents Augusto was showing him, Daniel's father, the simple construction worker who had lived in a modest house and driven an old truck and never spent money on anything unnecessary, had been worth over $20 million. And it had all been sitting in trusts and accounts waiting for Daniel. This can't be real, Daniel whispered. It's very real. Your father was a shrewd investor. He worked hard, yes, but he also worked smart. Every dollar he earned, he saved or invested. He bought properties when they were cheap, invested in stocks before they boomed, bought into small businesses that had potential. Over 30 years, his investments grew exponentially, but he never touched them. He lived simply, worked with his hands, and accumulated wealth quietly. But why? Why live like that if he had all this money? Because your father understood something most people don't. Money reveals character. He wanted you to grow up learning the value of hard work, of integrity, of treating people fairly. He didn't want you to be spoiled or entitled. He wanted you to build something yourself, to know what it meant to earn what you had, and more importantly, he wanted you to choose your life partner, your friends, the people you surrounded yourself with, based on who you were as a person, not on how much money you had. Daniel felt tears streaming down his face now, unable to stop them. He wanted me to be tested. Yes, he made me promise that I would only reveal this inheritance to you under specific circumstances, either when you turned 50 and had, in his words, hopefully learned enough about life and people to use the money wisely, or... Augusto paused, his expression sympathetic. Or when you had been through a trial that tested the loyalty of the people around you, a trial that revealed their true character. He knew, Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. He knew someone might try to destroy me. Not specifically, but your father understood human nature. He understood that when someone has something valuable, there are always those who will try to take it rather than earn it themselves. He wanted you to know who you could trust before you had access to this kind of wealth. So all of this, everything that's happened, was part of some test. Daniel felt a surge of anger. My business destroyed, my marriage ended, my life ruined. Also my dead father could teach me a lesson. Augusto reached across the table and placed his hand on Daniel's arm, his grip firm and grounding. Your business was destroyed by a criminal. Your marriage ended because your wife showed you who she truly was. Your life was not ruined, Daniel. It was clarified. These things would have happened eventually, with or without your father's test. Better it happened now, while you're still young enough to rebuild and start over, than 20 years from now, when you would have wasted even more of your life with the wrong people. Daniel wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew Augusto was right. If Mariana was the kind of person who would abandon him the moment things got hard, who would cheat on him with someone who could offer her more money and status, then better to know it now than after decades of marriage or after having children with her. If his business relationships were so fragile that they could be destroyed by manipulation and lies, then they weren't as solid as he had thought. And if Roberto Mendez was the kind of man who would orchestrate someone's destruction for personal gain, then Daniel had dodged a bullet by not going into business with him. "There's something else you need to know," Augusto said, pulling out another document. "Roberto Mendez knew about your inheritance." Daniel's blood went cold. "What?" "About 6 months ago, there was a leak in the city's property records office. Some documents that should have been sealed were accidentally made public for a few hours before the error was discovered. Roberto Mendez employs people whose job it is to search for exactly these kinds of opportunities. They found the documents showing your father's holdings and the fact that you were the beneficiary. So he knew I was going to be rich." "Exactly. And he came up with a plan. If he could destroy you financially and personally, make you look like a failure, he could potentially contest your inheritance, claim that you were mentally unstable or incompetent to manage the estate. He could tie it up in courts for years, maybe even get himself appointed as some kind of trustee or executor. And in the process, he could siphon off money, make investments that benefited himself, essentially steal your inheritance while hiding behind legal proceedings." Daniel felt sick. "And Mariana? From what I've been able to gather, he researched you thoroughly before that first meeting, found your wife on social media, saw that she was unhappy, that she wanted more than her life was giving her. He seduced her, promised her wealth and luxury, turned her against you. She was both a tool for his plan and a way to humiliate you completely. The ultimate power play, not just taking your money, but also taking your woman." Daniel sat back, trying to process everything. Roberto hadn't just been greedy. He had been deliberately, systematically cruel. He had orchestrated Daniel's destruction as part of a plan to steal an inheritance Daniel hadn't even known existed, and Mariana had been a willing participant, whether she fully understood Roberto's motives or not. "What do I do now?" Daniel asked. Augusto smiled for the first time since sitting down. "Now, Daniel, you take what's rightfully yours, and if you want, we make sure that Roberto Mendez and everyone who helped him pays for what they've done." Over the next 2 months, Daniel and Augusto worked in absolute secrecy. The first step was securing the inheritance, which required extensive legal work to transfer all the holdings into Daniel's name. Augusto introduced him to a team of lawyers who specialized in estate law, corporate law, and criminal law. They filed all the necessary paperwork quietly, making sure nothing was public until Daniel was ready. Simultaneously, Daniel had the lawyers begin investigating Roberto Mendez. They discovered a pattern of behavior that went back years. Roberto had built his business empire partly through hard work and smart investments, but also through fraud, intimidation, market manipulation, and occasionally outright theft. He had destroyed competitors, stolen patented designs, bribed inspectors, and left a trail of ruined businesses and broken people in his wake. But he had always been careful, always covered his tracks well enough that he was never caught. This time, though, he had made mistakes. Perhaps because he was so focused on destroying Daniel, perhaps because he was getting arrogant after years of never facing consequences, Roberto had left evidence. The lawyers found paper trails showing how Roberto had contacted Daniel's clients and suppliers, how he had spread false rumors about Daniel's business practices, how he had bribed a bank employee to flag Daniel's account with false fraud allegations. They found records of payments Roberto had made to various people involved in the conspiracy, and they found communications between Roberto and some of his business associates discussing the plan to eventually steal Daniel's inheritance. All of it was documented, recorded, undeniable. While the lawyers worked on building a legal case, Daniel lived in a strange state of limbo. He continued working construction during the day, continued living in the boarding house, continued to let everyone believe he was broken and destroyed. But now, knowing the truth, knowing that he was actually one of the wealthiest people in the city, it all felt surreal. He would be at a construction site, hauling materials in the hot sun alongside men who were working to feed their families, and he would think about the fact that he had enough money in investment accounts to buy the entire construction company they were working for. He would eat cheap meals at the diner, counting his money to make sure he had enough for rent, and he would think about the real estate holdings that were generating income every month. He would see social media posts from Mariana, showing off her luxurious life with Roberto, and instead of pain, he felt a strange kind of pity. She had traded a man who genuinely loved her for a criminal who was using her. She had chosen a life built on fraud and cruelty, instead of one built on honesty and work. And she had no idea that the man she had called a failure was actually wealthier than the man she had left him for. "When do we make our move?" Daniel asked Augusto one evening, meeting in the lawyer's office after work. "Soon," Augusto replied. "The lawyers want to make sure everything is airtight. We only get one chance at this. If we move too soon and Roberto manages to wiggle out of it, he'll disappear, hide his assets, and we may never get justice. But if we wait until everything is perfect, until we have him completely surrounded with no escape," he smiled grimly, "then we end him." The day finally came on a Thursday morning in late January. Daniel woke up in his small room in the boarding house for what he knew would be the last time. Today, everything would change. He showered in the communal bathroom, dressed in his work clothes out of habit, and met Augusto and the team of lawyers at their office downtown. "Are you ready?" Augusto asked. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready." That morning, Daniel's lawyers filed multiple lawsuits against Roberto Mendez and his business associates. They filed criminal complaints with detailed evidence of fraud, conspiracy, market manipulation, extortion, bribery, and a dozen other charges. They provided all of this evidence to both local police and federal authorities, who had been briefed in advance and were ready to act. Simultaneously, Daniel officially claimed his father's inheritance. The lawyers filed all the necessary documents with the courts, releasing the sealed trusts and accounts, transferring properties and holdings into Daniel's name. By noon, the news had started to spread throughout the city's business community. Roberto Mendez had been arrested at his office by federal agents. His business accounts had been frozen pending investigation. His construction company's operations had been halted by cease and desist orders. And Daniel Ferreira, the man everyone thought had been destroyed and was working as a day laborer, had just become one of the wealthiest men in the state. The lawyers held a press conference that afternoon, laying out the case against Roberto Mendez in clear, undeniable terms. They presented evidence of his decades-long pattern of criminal business practices. They explained how he had deliberately destroyed Daniel's business as part of a scheme to steal Daniel's inheritance. They showed communications proving he had known about the inheritance and had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. The story exploded across local media, then regional, then national. It had everything: betrayal, conspiracy, a David and Goliath story, the downfall of a powerful man, the vindication of an honest one. Mariana called Daniel's phone 17 times that first day. He didn't answer. What could she possibly say? She called Augusto's office, demanding to speak with Daniel. The receptionist politely told her that Mr. Ferreira was unavailable and would not be taking her calls. She showed up at the boarding house that evening, but Daniel had already checked out. She went to the lawyer's office the next morning, but security wouldn't let her pass the lobby. Finally, on the third day, Daniel agreed to meet her. Not because he wanted to reconcile, not because he was interested in anything she had to say, but because he felt it was necessary for closure. They met at a small coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. When Daniel walked in wearing clothes that actually fit properly for the first time in months, having gotten a haircut and looking more like his old self, Mariana barely recognized him. She stood up from the table, and he could see that she had been crying. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes red and swollen. She looked nothing like the radiant, happy woman in all those social media posts. "Daniel," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Roberto, I didn't know what he was doing to you. I didn't know about any of it. Please, you have to believe me." Daniel sat down across from her, his expression calm and neutral. "Did you know about the inheritance?" he asked. "No, I swear I didn't. I just found out when everyone else did. If you had known, you would have stayed with me for the money," Daniel interrupted. "Which isn't really better, is it?" Mariana flinched. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Daniel leaned forward. "Mariana, when you thought I had lost everything, when you thought I was a failure, you called me pathetic. You told me I would never amount to anything. You said I was weak and that you deserved better. You left me for a man who could give you luxury and status. And now that you know I'm actually wealthy, now you want to come back. Can you not see how that proves exactly what kind of person you are? I loved you, she said desperately. I still love you. I made mistakes, yes, but people make mistakes. We could start over, we could— No, Daniel said firmly. We can't. And here's why. For 12 years, I gave you everything I had. It wasn't much by the standards of wealthy people, but it was honest. It was real. Every day I worked hard to provide for us, to build a life together. I treated you with respect and kindness. I was faithful and supportive, and the moment you thought I had lost that ability to provide, you abandoned me. You didn't just leave, Mariana. You humiliated me, you mocked me, you called me a failure and a loser. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less firm. The test wasn't whether I could survive being ruined. The test was whether you would stay with me during the ruin, and you failed. You failed completely. You showed me that your love was conditional on money and status, not on who I am as a person. And that's not love, Mariana. That's just transaction. Tears streamed down her face. Please, I know I don't deserve it, but please give me another chance. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. The rest of your life? Daniel said. You didn't want to spend the rest of your life with me when you thought I was poor. Why would I believe you want to now that you know I'm rich? No, Mariana. You made your choice. You chose Roberto and his money and the life he promised you. And now you get to live with that choice. But Roberto is in jail. Everything he promised me is gone. I have nothing. And there it was. The truth laid bare. She wasn't sorry for betraying him. She wasn't sorry for the pain she had caused. She was sorry that her gamble hadn't paid off, that she had bet on the wrong horse. That's not my problem, Daniel said, standing up. You're an adult who made adult choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice small and desperate. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and despite everything, he felt something that might have been pity. I don't know, Mariana. Maybe get a job. Work hard. Build a life for yourself based on your own efforts, instead of trying to attach yourself to men who can provide for you. Maybe learn that real wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in relationships built on genuine love and loyalty. Maybe become the person you should have been all along. He turned to leave and she called after him. Daniel, wait. At least could you help me? Just a little? I'm going to lose my apartment. I don't have any money saved. I don't— He turned back and his expression stopped whatever else she was going to say. Help you? After everything you did? After you called me a loser and a failure? After you abandoned me when I needed you most? After you went to another man's bed while we were still married? You want me to help you? He shook his head. No, you're on your own, just like you left me on my own. Good luck, Mariana. I genuinely hope you figure your life out, but I won't be part of it. And with that, Daniel walked out of the coffee shop and out of Mariana's life forever. He didn't look back. The weeks and months that followed brought dramatic changes. Roberto Mendez was formally charged with dozens of crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his lawyers advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims, and his construction empire collapsed completely. His wife divorced him, his children refused to speak to him, and his name became synonymous with corporate crime in the state. 3 of his business associates who had helped in the conspiracy against Daniel also faced charges. 1 went to jail. The other 2 lost everything in the legal proceedings and civil suits. The bank employee who had been bribed to flag Daniel's account was fired and charged with fraud. She lost her banking license and had to take a job as a cashier at a grocery store. Daniel's former clients and suppliers who had abandoned him so quickly found themselves facing hard questions about their own ethics and loyalty. Some tried to reach out to Daniel, offering apologies and wanting to resume their business relationships, but Daniel was selective about who he chose to work with moving forward. Daniel reopened his construction materials business, but this time with proper investment, a solid infrastructure, and a careful selection of employees and partners. He hired back Juan, Michael, and Sarah, his former employees, with significant raises and benefit packages. He also hired Paolo, the older laborer who had spoken to him with such wisdom during his darkest days, giving him a comfortable position as a consultant and mentor to younger employees. He expanded slowly and carefully, opening 2 new locations over the next year, but always maintaining the personal touch and ethical standards that had characterized his father's business and his own. He created a foundation in his father's name, dedicated to helping small business owners who faced financial difficulties or were targeted by unethical competitors. The foundation offered free legal assistance, business consulting, and emergency loans at 0 interest. He quietly bought the boarding house where he had lived during his lowest point and renovated it completely, converting it into clean, affordable housing for working families who were struggling. He kept the rents low, prioritizing helping people over maximizing profit. He established a scholarship program for children from low-income families who wanted to learn trades like construction, plumbing, or electrical work, providing not just tuition, but also tools and job placement assistance. The media loved Daniel's story. He was invited to speak at business schools, to write op-eds about ethics in business, to appear on television programs about integrity and redemption. But Daniel remained humble throughout it all, always emphasizing that his success was built on his father's wisdom and sacrifice, and that the real measure of a person wasn't how much money they had, but how they treated others, especially when times were hard. One afternoon, about 18 months after everything had changed, Daniel was in his new office, a modest space above the main shop floor where he could watch his employees work and stay connected to the actual business. He heard a knock on the door and looked up to see a familiar face. Roberto Mendez, except it wasn't the Roberto he remembered. This Roberto was thin, gaunt, his silver hair now completely white, wearing a cheap suit that hung loosely on his frame. His face was lined with exhaustion and regret, making him look a decade older than his actual age. He had been released from prison early for good behavior and health reasons. He'd had a heart attack in prison and had been given compassionate release to serve the remainder of his sentence under house arrest. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, standing up. "I know I have no right to be here," Roberto said, his voice rough and tired. "I know you probably never want to see me again, but I needed to try to explain, or maybe not explain, because there's no explanation that makes what I did acceptable. Maybe I just needed to apologize." "You apologized in your plea hearing. I watched it. You apologized to all your victims, including me." "That was for the judge and the cameras. This is just for you." Roberto gestured to a chair. "May I?" Daniel nodded, and Roberto sat down heavily, as if the simple action exhausted him. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did and why I did it. The prosecutors said it was greed, and that's part of it. But it was more than that. I saw what your father had left you, and I was furious. Here was this simple construction worker, who had never done anything remarkable, who had just lived quietly and invested wisely, and he had accumulated more wealth than I had with all my scheming and hustling and backstabbing. It made me feel like a fool, like my whole life had been wasted chasing the wrong things in the wrong ways." He looked directly at Daniel. "And then I met you, and you were exactly like him, honest, hardworking, decent, and that made it worse, because you didn't deserve that inheritance in my mind. You hadn't earned it through ruthlessness or ambition. You had just been born lucky, with a father who was smarter than mine. So, I decided to take it from you. I told myself I deserved it more, that I would use it better, that someone like you didn't need that kind of money because you were too simple to appreciate it." "And Mariana?" Daniel asked quietly. Roberto flinched. "That was the cruelest part, and the part I'm most ashamed of. I researched you thoroughly, found her on social media, saw that she was restless, unhappy with what she saw as a small life. I seduced her deliberately, fed her lies about how wonderful life could be, showed her glimpses of luxury and power, played on her insecurities and desires. I used her to hurt you, and I didn't care that I was destroying a marriage or playing with a real person's emotions. To me, she was just a tool, a way to break you completely before I took everything you had." "Did she know about your plan?" "No, she thought it was a real affair, a real relationship. She had no idea I was using her. When everything came out, when she learned the truth, she was devastated. Not because she felt bad for you, I suspect, but because she realized she had been played as thoroughly as you had been. Roberto paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. There's no excuse for what I did. I destroyed your business, ruined your marriage, tried to steal your inheritance. I hurt dozens of other people over the years with my schemes. I built an empire on fraud and cruelty, and I told myself it was just business, just the way the world works. But I was wrong. The way the world works is that eventually the bill comes due. Eventually you pay for your sins. Why are you telling me this? Daniel asked. Because you deserve to know the full truth, and because I wanted you to know that your father was right. Right about what? About the test. About teaching you through experience rather than just words. I learned about his plan from one of the lawyers during the trial, how he had hidden the inheritance to teach you about character and loyalty. At first, I thought it was cruel to let your own son struggle like that, but then I realized it was the most loving thing a father could do. He knew that money without wisdom is dangerous. He knew that you needed to learn who you could trust before you had the power that comes with wealth. And he was right. Look at you now, you're wealthy, yes, but you haven't changed. You're still working alongside your employees, still living in a modest house, even though you could buy a mansion, still helping people and treating everyone with dignity. You learned the lesson he was trying to teach. Roberto stood up slowly, preparing to leave. I know you have every reason to hate me. I destroyed your life, or tried to. But you took that destruction and used it to become stronger, wiser, better. That's something I never learned how to do. I always thought strength was in destroying others, taking what they had, proving I was superior. But real strength is what you have, the ability to survive loss, to maintain your integrity when the world is falling apart, to rebuild without becoming bitter or cruel. He moved toward the door, then turned back one last time. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I recognize what you are and what I could have been if I had made different choices. Daniel watched him go, feeling a complex mix of emotions. He wasn't sure if what he felt was forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something closer to understanding, a recognition that Roberto Mendez was a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you prioritize wealth and power over character and integrity. A few minutes later, there was another knock on his door. It was Paulo, the older construction worker who now served as Daniel's consultant and friend. Was that who I thought it was? Paulo asked. Yes. Roberto came to apologize. Are you okay? Daniel thought about the question. Was he okay? His father had put him through a test he hadn't known he was taking. His wife had betrayed him and shown him that her love was conditional. His business had been destroyed and had to be rebuilt from nothing. He had lost everything and everyone he thought he could count on. And yet... I'm better than okay, Daniel said, and realized he meant it. I'm free. Free from a marriage that was built on false foundations. Free from the naivety that everyone is good and trustworthy. Free from the burden of not knowing who really cares about me. My father's test was hard, maybe one of the hardest things I've ever been through, but it gave me something invaluable. Clarity. I know who I am now. I know who I can trust. I know what really matters. Paulo smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. Your father would be proud. Years continued to pass, and Daniel's life took on a rhythm that was fulfilling in ways his old life never had been. He dated occasionally but carefully, making sure any woman he was interested in knew him as Daniel the person, not Daniel the millionaire. He eventually met someone, a teacher named Sophia, who had no idea who he was when they met at a community volunteering event. She knew him for 6 months before she learned about his wealth, and when she found out, her reaction was to laugh and say, "Well, that explains why you were so generous with donating to my classroom supply fund." They took things slow, building a relationship based on genuine connection, shared values and mutual respect. The construction materials business continued to thrive, but Daniel never let it become an empire. He kept it manageable, human scale, the kind of business where he could still know his employees' names and their families, where handshake deals still meant something, where reputation mattered more than profit margins. The foundation he had created in his father's name helped hundreds of small business owners over the years, many of whom had been targeted by unethical competitors or had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. Daniel took particular satisfaction in helping others avoid the fate he had nearly suffered. The story of his rise, fall, and redemption became something of a legend in business schools and among entrepreneurs. He was invited to give speeches, but he always gave the same message. Success isn't measured in dollars or assets. It's measured in character, in how you treat people when you have power over them, in whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and respect what you see. My father left me money, yes, but the real inheritance was the lesson. And that lesson is this: build your life on integrity, choose your people wisely, and never compromise your values for temporary gain. One day, about 5 years after everything had changed, Daniel received a letter. It was from Mariana. He hadn't heard from her in years, not since that meeting at the coffee shop. He almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of him. The letter was long, handwritten on simple notebook paper, not the expensive stationery she used to prefer. She wrote about how her life had fallen apart after leaving him, how she had lost her job at the boutique when the scandal broke, how she had struggled to find work because people recognized her as that woman who betrayed Daniel Ferreira. She wrote about how she had to move to a different city, change her name slightly, start completely over. She wrote about the years of therapy she had gone through, working on herself, trying to understand why she had made such terrible choices. She wrote about how she had eventually found work as a manager at a small retail store. Nothing glamorous but honest work that she had grown to appreciate. She had dated a few men, but nothing serious, because she realized she needed to learn to be comfortable with herself before she could be with anyone else. The letter ended with something Daniel hadn't expected. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for another chance or for money. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you tried to tell me in that coffee shop. You were right about everything. I didn't love you for who you were. I loved you for what you represented: security, stability, a comfortable life. And when I thought you couldn't provide that anymore, I jumped ship for someone who could offer more. I used to blame Roberto for seducing me, but the truth is, I wanted to be seduced. I wanted the easy path to wealth and luxury, and I was willing to betray a good man to get it. I've spent 5 years becoming someone who would never make that choice again. I've learned to value integrity over image, character over cash, loyalty over luxury. I've learned to work hard for what I have and to appreciate the simple things: a job well done, a kind word from a co-worker, a quiet evening at home. I've learned all the lessons you and your father tried to teach me, but I had to lose everything to learn them. I know you've moved on. I've seen the articles about you and Sophia. She seems wonderful, and I'm genuinely happy for you. You deserve someone who sees your worth, who values you for who you are, not what you have. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for being the catalyst for my growth, even though it wasn't your intention. Thank you for refusing to take me back, because it forced me to become self-sufficient. And thank you for showing me, through your example, what it means to live with integrity. I hope you're happy, Daniel. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Daniel read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in a drawer. He felt no anger, no lingering pain, just a quiet satisfaction that Mariana had apparently learned and grown. He didn't reply to the letter. There was nothing to say. That chapter of his life was closed, and he had no desire to reopen it, even for the sake of closure. She had said what she needed to say, and that was enough. The years continued to roll by. Daniel married Sophia in a simple ceremony, attended by close friends and family. They bought a modest house with a big backyard where Daniel could garden, returning to the tomatoes and peppers he had always loved. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and Daniel raised them the way his father had raised him, with love, with clear values, with an emphasis on character over wealth. He never hid his wealth from them, but he also never let it define them. They attended public schools, did chores for their allowance, learned to work hard and treat people with respect. Daniel told them stories about their grandfather, about the test he had created, about the lessons of loyalty and character. He told them about his fall and redemption, wanting them to understand that failure isn't the end, that character is revealed in how you respond to adversity, that true strength is in maintaining your integrity when the world is testing you. Roberto Mendez died in his sleep at age 72, still under house arrest, never having rebuilt anything close to the life he once had. Daniel didn't attend the funeral, but he read the obituary. It was sparse, mentioning his business achievements but also his criminal conviction, a legacy forever tarnished. When Daniel thought about Roberto, he felt neither satisfaction at his downfall nor forgiveness for his crimes. He felt only a kind of sad understanding. Here was a man who had all the opportunities in the world, who had built an empire, but who had built it on sand. And when the tide came in, as it always does, there was nothing solid left to hold on to. Mariana lived out her life in the city where she had moved, never marrying, never achieving the luxury and status she had once craved. She worked her way up to regional manager for her retail company, a respectable position that brought her modest comfort. She made peace with her choices and found a kind of contentment in simplicity. Daniel heard about her occasionally through the small-town network of connections that exists in any community, but they never crossed paths again. Both had moved on completely, living separate lives that occasionally intersected in memory but never in reality. On Daniel's 60th birthday, surrounded by his family and closest friends, someone asked him to give a toast. He stood, looking around at the faces of the people he loved, people who had proven their loyalty and character over years and decades, and he spoke from the heart. My father once told me that the measure of a man isn't in what he accumulates, but in what he builds. Not just businesses or wealth, but relationships, character, integrity. He taught me that lesson in an unusual way, through a test I didn't know I was taking, and that test, as painful as it was, gave me the greatest gift anyone could receive: clarity. It showed me who really cared about me, who was truly loyal, who had genuine character. It stripped away all the pretense and left only truth. I lost a lot during that time. I lost my business, my marriage, my reputation, my sense of security. But in losing all of that, I gained something far more valuable. I gained wisdom, I gained perspective, I gained the ability to distinguish between people who love you for who you are and people who love you for what you can give them. I gained the understanding that true wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in the relationships you build, the lives you touch, the integrity you maintain. He raised his glass. So I want to toast to my father, who loved me enough to teach me the hard way, to my true friends who stayed with me when I had nothing, to my wife and children, who are my greatest treasure, and to everyone who has learned that real success isn't about how high you climb, but about how you treat people on the way up, and how you respond when you inevitably fall, because we all fall at some point. The question is, who will we be when we get back up? The room erupted in applause, and as Daniel looked around at these faces, these genuine relationships built on truth and loyalty, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the simple son of a construction worker to a modest business owner, to a man seemingly destroyed, to someone who had risen again with wisdom and wealth, but, more importantly, with character intact. The revenge he had taken against those who wronged him hadn't been violent or even particularly dramatic. He hadn't destroyed them with his own hands. He had simply let the truth come out, let justice take its course, and then lived well. He had refused to become bitter or cruel. He had maintained his integrity even when the world seemed to reward only ruthlessness. He had chosen to help others rather than hoard his wealth. He had rebuilt with wisdom rather than with anger. And in doing so, he had proven something his father had always known, that the best revenge isn't in destroying your enemies, but in becoming so successful, so happy, so clearly at peace with yourself that the simple comparison between your life and theirs becomes its own judgment. The most powerful justice isn't the kind that screams and destroys, it's the kind that quietly, inevitably, illuminates the difference between a life built on character and a life built on deception, between dignity and desperation, between being and merely appearing. Daniel had won not by fighting his enemies on their terms, but by refusing to become like them. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.